not just because of the misbehavior of one country or the mistaken choices of one business leader, but instead from the collapse of our ability to deal with large-scale change. I saw a world that was increasingly becoming chaotic. So in 2017 and into 2018, I started working on a new framework for having a language for this kind of chaotic world. VUCA seemed insufficient. Volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity all just seemed seemed to pale in significance, seemed to come up short in really describing the world that we were increasingly moving into. I think one of the initial catalysts for me thinking about this was the election of Donald Trump in the United States in 2016, because that didn't make sense. It's like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Why did it happen? When there's a longtime futurist, a professor named Jim Dator, D-A-T-O-R, who once articulated the argument that any useful idea about the future must initially seem ridiculous. And he said, well, now that Trump has been elected, I don't need to say that anymore because everybody understands it. The future is increasingly ridiculous. So why? What's going on here? It's not just VUCA. It can't be just VUCA. And so over the course of 2018, I built out this BANI model of brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible, because those terms to me seemed a better fit for what I was observing around it and the kinds of processes I saw in action. And so I presented the BANI concept initially to the Institute for the Future in late 2018 at a conference about the future of power. And it was moderately well received, but in particular, I got very strong reactions from people who were visiting the Institute from places like Brazil. And so over the course of 2019,
the response there is huge, yeah. When you go to YouTube, the response is huge. That doesn't come by surprise, massive. I would assume.
Well, it came by surprise at the time, but now that I see what's going on, now that I've had a chance to visit Brazil, I can really appreciate why they grabbed onto this language as being meaningful. I continue to think about it and play with the concept throughout 2019, and in April of 2020, shortly after the pandemic began, I decided this language needs to be seen by more people, and so I published on Medium the article facing a world of chaos, and things started to go off from there. But at its roots, the idea of BANI is, for me, a way of articulating the gravity of the situation, articulating just how large scale the problems are that we face, the challenges are that we face, and consequently how large scale our responses have to be. We can't just play around the edges of this. We have to make fundamental changes to how we behave as a civilization to be able to grapple with, to be able to deal with the age of chaos.
Now you mentioned, well, it gives lens, a different point of view to look at things. And how could it impact our daily life, our daily working life? I think this is one of the questions that will come up tonight again and again. Now, what does it mean for us as professionals? How can we work with it, and how can we use it for our work in the daily life?
Well, I see it being useful, at least from my experience in working with people who have been using it, see it being useful in three broad ways, three general ways. The first is simply as a language, simply a way to articulate the kinds of problems that as an organization you may be facing, as a country, as a planet we're facing, to really emphasize the scale and the sheer chaos of so many of these issues. And so it just becomes a common language that people can use that means something beyond simply, wow, things are bad. It's like, okay, now we understand that they're bad in ways that make them brittle, in ways that make them incomprehensible, etc. The second is that for me, it gives a way of gauging strategy and decisions. Will this decision that I make as an individual, that we make as an organization, that we vote on as a country, will this decision make things worse in one of these four sectors? Will things become more brittle? Could this make things more brittle? Will this increase our sense of anxiety and our sense of fear about the future? Will this become nonlinear or disconnection between cause and effect? Will it increase the scale of the consequences? Does it make sense? And that these may seem like simple questions, but they are questions that need to be asked. You know, so often we kind of assume things will be fine, but rather than just thinking, well, we'll make things a little worse. No, does this really? How does this affect us in this broader scale of change?
It's like a
And
control question as well, yeah?
Right. You may not have a good answer, but it is a way of at least asking the question. Mm-hmm. Lastly, I see it as as offering up a question in and of itself of what are the kinds of behavioral changes that we can make as people, as a civilization, that can reduce the severity of a BANI world. And so while it's tempting to try to come up with a one-to-one, for a brittle world, behave more, resiliently. I tried to avoid doing that one-to-one because that seemed a little simplistic to me. But I have, in the talks that I've given, the conversations I've had, there are three ways of looking at the world, three kinds of behavioral and structural changes that can be made that seem to, for many people, resonate as a way of responding to a BANI world. The first is resilience, to increase our capacity to adapt, to withstand shocks without breaking, to basically be ready for the unexpected. So the companies that had in the United States, that had in California been preparing for an earthquake, had plans in place for working remotely, for making sure they had excuse me, good supply lines. Those companies managed to respond more quickly and more effectively, at least initially, to the pandemic, simply because they already had in place some plans around dealing with an unexpected shock that was not identical by any means, but similar enough that they had a sense of what to do.
That would be then the answer, or the reaction really to brittleness, yeah, just to sum it up. That would, yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So that, just to, that's, they didn't have enough prepared to be completely fine throughout the the 2 years plus of the pandemic, but they were able to respond more intelligently. We can see the opposite in action with microprocessors. The global industry around microprocessors has from early on been structured as a just-in-time model. High efficiency, get out as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and be able to turn on a dime. To basically, we don't need, we have to plug in this module that we got for our car assembly, and it just arrived this morning. That's perfect because we're just assembling it now. So it's that sense of everything being on the knife's edge, which when it works beautifully, is very profitable. But when it breaks hard. And so what we saw as the initial knee-jerk reaction to the onset of the pandemic, as bad is certainly as bad as it got in 2020, many companies stopped ordering the microprocessors because they didn't need them immediately, which caused the microprocessor companies to cut back on the ordering of their components, which basically had this chain reaction all the way back, so that we still find it very difficult to to manufacture enough microprocessors to meet a sudden increase in demand. There is, just as a very small example, the graphics cards for computers that are good for playing games, you can't find them for under $1,000 now. They should cost at around $200 and up, but the prices have gone up 5 to 10 times because they're so hard to get, and they have become very useful in an unexpected way as a mechanism for doing blockchain coin mining. It's for running the calculations for a proof of work type blockchain system. All of this means that the system around microprocessors was not resilient, was not able to withstand the shock of change because it was built around a model of not being resilient. But if we are in a world where chaotic events like pandemics, like potential wars in Europe, if these are emerging with greater frequency, if the impacts of climate disasters are occurring more frequently, then a business model around high efficiency, just-in-time actions is going to fail more often. And building your business, building your organization around resilience, having some slack in the system, being able to adapt to just having a short downturn in demand or a short downturn in supply because you have some reserves, that ends up proving more responsible, ends up proving more effective in a world of chaos. Another concept that I find to be very effective, and people in the various groups I've talked with have responded well to, is the notion of improvisation. That is, being able to come up on the fly, be able to understand that the situation has changed and I need to come up with a new response to a changed system rather than relying on a rote script of responses. So in theater, there's everything around improv theater of they shout out into the crowd, you come up with an idea, and the actors on stage respond and create an entire scene on the basis of that one shouted term from the audience. And that's sort of the core example of improvisation. But we see it all around us when we are go to a grocery store and they don't have the product that we want, but they have similar products. You have to make a decision on the fly. Is this, will this different type of butter work for me? Just as it off the top of my head example. And so you probably all know people who, when faced with these kinds of decisions, kind of freeze up. When faced with things aren't the way I expect them to be, I don't know what to do. And we need to avoid that kind of behavior, that kind of response. Instead, we need to be able to look at a system, look at a changing system, and sort of figure out in the moment, what step can I take? What path should I take? I don't know if it's going to be the right path, but I have a good sense that it's the kind of path that should work. That capacity to improvise, to innovate even, becomes extremely critical in a chaotic world. And it's something that can be practiced. I encourage people who want to hone these skills to actually take classes in improvisational theater, because it just gets you accustomed to having to respond immediately to a changing, unexpected world.
And it's about overcoming the fear of chaos as well, I would assume.
Exactly. So overcoming the decision paralysis is the term that I've often seen. When you have choices, none of them is perfect. None of them is scripted for you. What choice do I make? And lastly, and I think most importantly, is empathy. The understanding that other people have lived experiences beyond just the moment you encounter with them. And that can be just for the person that is speeding alongside you on the highway and cuts you off. Maybe they have something that they're going through that makes them need to rush to where they are. It can be for the people that you work with. You know, your partner is having a bad day and snaps at you. Well, you can understand that perhaps there's been a death in the family. These are very simplistic examples of the idea of being understanding of each other's humanity. Because in a chaotic world, in this age of chaos, we are increasingly encountering each other in our worst possible states. The people that you work with, the people who work for you, the people that you encounter in your day-to-day activities, you know, the clerk at the grocery store. Very often we are encountering people who are going through trauma. And we need to be able to step back and not respond in a way that exacerbates their trauma because it, you know, whatever thing they've said or whatever choice they make is annoying. But instead to understand that this trauma will have an impact, and asking what choices can I make as an individual, what choices can we make as an organization, as a nation, that will reduce the impact of trauma on the people that we work with.
You say
now,
reduce the impact of trauma. That's what you're saying. Reduce the impact of trauma.
And I understand that's not a very business formal kind of piece of language, you know, not a concept that is articulated easily as a checklist. But increasingly, not just over the past couple of years of working around the BANI concept, but more broadly of working in this world of foresight for 25 years or more, it's become very clear to me that an unwillingness to understand the perspective of someone else is one of the drivers of failure at planetary level, at a national level, at an organizational level. And the language that we have around understanding the experiences of others is essentially the language of empathy. And so the combination of these three changes to behavior, forms of behavior, increased resilience, increased improvisation, increased empathy. Through my analysis, for what I've seen, these seem to be very powerful ways of working within a chaotic environment, an age of chaos, working within a BANI environment in a way that doesn't increase harm.
Thank you for that, Jamais. I think we will have exactly this part to go into more detail than in the breakout sessions as well. And what I'd like to go into now as well is your role as a futurist, really, because we had that chat just before everybody was joining, and you said quite strongly. You said, like, I wish I was wrong.
Right. I work with quite a few, you know, dozens, if not hundreds, of other professional futurists. And I am, you know, they're in my community on Twitter. They're people that I work with on a daily basis. They're people that I follow and I speak to. And nearly everyone I've talked to about this issue has responded, yes, I agree. I wish I was wrong. You know,
this issue, sorry, just for everybody who is in this issue, you mean?
Well, just everybody that I'm talking to about the dilemmas around being a futurist. The challenges of being a futurist in a world like this is this visceral, you know, stomach-churning a desire to be wrong about all of this, because so many of the dynamics that we see underway around climate especially, but also around our response to pandemic, around artificial intelligence, around income inequality and racial and ethnic inequalities. So many of these issues seem to be headed in the wrong direction when we know what we can do to fix them.
As a society, we know.
As a society, we know what to do. We know exactly how to make sure that we don't end up in a planetary catastrophe around climate. But it will cost money. It won't be as profitable. It will be, challenging, but it's possible, and we know what to do. The problem is that the people who are currently in the positions to make decisions around these things are really reluctant to put themselves at risk, to put their money at risk. And we see this across the spectrum of issues that we encounter as a planet. And so the people that I work with as futurists, we look at all this, we see these systems in action. Futurists are in many ways reverse historians. So you think about what a modern historian does. They look back at the course of history, but not just to document as a checklist of this happened and that happened, but really to understand why things happened. And so the historians have an understanding of the processes, the social and demographic and cultural changes that happen that push history forward. What futurists do is take that same kind of thinking and speculate and say, okay, we know that this has been the historical process around transportation, around mobility. What are the kinds of changes we should expect to see going forward, given the other changes that we know are happening in the world? And so when we look at the world, as a futurist, I look at the world and through that lens of the processes that we have been engaged in for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and look ahead at where they might take us, it's very disheartening. It's very frustrating. And the kinds of forecasts that I make, the kinds of scenarios that I build around what the world could look like. I am working right now on a set of scenarios for what the state of California could look like in 10, 30, and 100 years. Now, the 100 years will be very abstract, not a lot of detail there, but the 10-year scenario and the 30-year scenarios are going to be painful, because it's very difficult as a futurist to look at the dynamics of change that are happening all around us and come away thinking, yes, things will get better quickly. I do think that things will get better. It's just going to take a long time to get there. I'm a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist, but that short-term keeps getting pushed out. So
in
that's
another talk we had, Jamais, you said something that is still sticking with me. You said, well, let us be good forefathers, ancestors. I can't say the word in English, but you can.
Good ancestors, yes.
Thank you for
it's
that.
It's actually Jonas Salk, a doctor who was the inventor, one of the inventors of the polio vaccine. Actually was the first to use this phrase, let us be good ancestors. Let us be the people that are descendants, that the people, decades, years, centuries from now can look back with pride, as opposed to looking back and feeling ashamed. We need to be good ancestors, good forefathers.
Which is a very strong question in a decision-taking process as well, yeah, and a very systemic view at it.
There are numerous phrases from a variety of cultures around the world that amount to, we need to make decisions based not on our own needs, but on the needs of future generations. In Native American culture, I can't remember which particular group, but they talk about a seven generation decision making. Make a decision not just now, but for the next 7 generations. And that's a very long term, and very few of us are really capable of thinking like that. It is something that you can learn to do, and you learn to do it relatively poorly, but still better than you could before. It's a difficult thing to do. And because your forecast, your visions of what the next generation will need will be wrong in different ways, you need to be able to think in terms of what can we do to improvise as we go to move towards the future that we want, move towards the future that's better. I was actually having a conversation with a colleague of mine at the Institute yesterday, and so much of our work these days about what we're trying to do as futurists, as consultants, as writers who communicate with people is to reduce the overall amount of misery in the world. You know, what choices can we make that will reduce misery? And that can be, as a company, what can we do to make things, to make things less miserable for people, for our stakeholders, for our customers, for our colleagues? What can we do to make the future less miserable for people who have to live on it? And so, when I often say that I really I have a lot of respect and hope for the up and coming young generation. The Gen Z is what they get referred to in the States. People who are 25 years old and younger. And it's because I recognize they have the most to lose. They have everything to lose. And so the ones that I've worked with are very conscious of that fact and are willing to take big steps.
Could you give us some more insight in the work you do with young people? I think that's something that the group will be interested as well. How do you work with this group of people, for example? Do you meet them regularly as a consultant, as a conversation partner? That's quite interesting, I think.
Well, most frequently it's with people who are either working with the Institute for the Future. They're interns, they're young people who are in college who want to get some experience. Sometimes it's with people who are similarly situated in the clients that we work with. I, at this point, don't have any group of young people that I consult with. However, there is an American website that actually has a fairly global footprint called Reddit, Reddit, that is extremely profane and superficial and filled with young people. Mm-hmm. A lot of it talks about news, about what's happening in the world. A lot of it's talking about what's happening in their communities, jokes that they're making, movies that they've seen, pornography that they've seen. It's really, it covers a wide spectrum of topics. Not everyone there is a kid. Not everyone there is a young person. There are people who are older than me who are regular participants. And there are millions of people who participate on this website. But for me, doing a survey, reading over the headline, the leading conversations on Reddit on a regular basis has actually given me some insight into the kinds of issues that younger people are most concerned about. Now, it's a subset of younger people, people who are aware of the world, who have internet connection, but that's an increasingly large part of the global populace. And so it's one of the ways in which I try to, no way will I say I understand your problems, but I have a better idea of what those problems can be. Mm-hmm. A lot of the language around anxiety, the A in BANI, comes from reading the articulations, the statements, the comments, the posts of these younger people about the world that they live in. In the United States in particular, it's very bad with college debt. I mean, there are young people who have hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that cannot be discharged in a bankruptcy. The American Congress passed a law 15 years ago that student loan debt can't be gotten rid of in a bankruptcy because too many kids were going bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And so we can't let that happen, the bank said. And so you have a great deal of anxiety for many of these younger people, a world where none of their choices look good. All of the choices that they see in front of them are bad. The last, or they have already gone past the last chance they had to make a good decision about a particular topic, be it education, starting a family, moving. And so this language of overwhelming constant anxiety really resonated for me as a framing of the world, especially for people who are not the ones in power, mm-hmm. people who are not the ones who make decisions about the planet, but instead are the ones who have to suffer, live with those decisions. And so it's not so much that I work on a daily basis with young people, but I take advantage of every chance I can to work with them in the works that I do, and I pay close attention to the various media that they use to communicate with each other.
I hope the discussions in your breakout rooms were stimulating. So in any case, you've sent us exciting questions, and we've just used the time in between to choose those who seems to be most interesting to go into the next level of the discussion. And we looked at them already with Jamais as well. And you should see now 2 questions coming from different groups, but pointing into the same direction. Jamais, is there also a best case scenario, was a question, an optimistic view next to worst case scenarios? And could you describe the impact of a best case scenario? How could we foster it? That's the question coming from the positive side of things then.
Well, I'm tempted to answer that this is the best case scenario, but that's a bit mean. From my perspective, I don't think of this as a worst case scenario so much as an identification of what could be pushing us towards a worst case scenario. One thing too that I have learned in doing this for a while is that in many cases, what you and I might consider a worst case scenario might be for someone else a best case scenario, because in that kind of world is where they make the most money, they gain the most power, they can eliminate the most of their opponents. We can't assume that our best case scenario is everyone's best case scenario. That said, it is quite possible and quite useful actually to think about what a best case scenario, if things worked right, if we made the right decisions, what could the world look like? That's actually a very useful practice, as long as it is not your only scenario of the future. When I do scenario work, like I'm doing right now for California, I always must include a multitude, a set of scenarios. So in this case, 4. 4 different scenarios, one of which is actually visibly, measurably better for most people. And that is there in part because it's aspirational. It gives us something to strive for. And in part because it's possible. One of the things that always surprised me when I started doing this work was how difficult it was for many organizations, many groups I worked with, to come up with a success scenario, to describe a world in which things worked the way they wanted it to work. Many organizations are not ready to deal with what happens if they win. I worked for an organization for a while that had as its goal the mission of spreading a particular kind of, well, spreading the concept of scenario planning. Because when it started out, scenario planning was something that was done largely by big companies like Shell and big governments. And so this company I worked for was trying to get more organizations and more consultants to use this practice, to use this tool. And by the time I left, they had done so. They had managed to convince a very large number of other consulting organizations, a very large number of other people who worked in this, the broad industry of foresight, to use this particular tool. And they didn't know what to do after they won. They didn't know what to do with themselves after they had managed to successfully spread out this idea. And so I use that as an example simply of many organizations don't have any plans for success. So even in a BANI world, success is still possible. It is still possible to achieve your goals. It is very useful then to have a scenario, to have a sense of what the world could look like if you are successful, if things turn out the way you would like them to turn out, or they mostly turn out that way. One of the things that I always try to emphasize in all of the scenarios that I create is that even worst case, even bad futures have moments and elements that are beneficial for people. Even frightening futures can be beneficial, can be helpful for some. Some people win even in these awful worlds. Conversely, even the best possible futures have elements that are problematic for people. So, as a real world example, a lot of the effort around moving to electric vehicles to cut our carbon emissions from transportation, that's great. If we manage to do so quickly, one of the side effects is that a lot of people who don't live in their own homes can't plug in their cars because they don't have a garage to plug in. And suddenly you have this whole infrastructure of trying to figure out where multiple people can plug in their cars for an hour to charge. And it is actually a big impact, a big hit on our energy infrastructure. So there are all of these consequences of good outcomes that need to be thought about too. So although a best case scenario is useful as an aspiration, as a way of thinking about success, it's not an endpoint. A science fiction writer that I know named Bruce Sterling once said that the future is not a destination, it's a journey. The future is not a goal, it's a process. So the best case scenario is best case for a moment, but things continue to change. And you can say the same thing for even a worst case scenario is a worst case for the moment as we respond, as we act, as we try to figure out what to do to deal with this catastrophe. And so I tend to be a bit leery of using worst case and best case, because that implies that, for the first, it implies that things couldn't get even worse than that. And the best case implies that things couldn't get any better, and when neither is true. What I try to do in my work, and what I would encourage other people to do when they think about possible futures, when they think about a BANI environment, is to think through a variety of consequences. In this future world where some things work and some things don't, how do we get there? What other kinds of consequences emerge from this set of changes? What other consequences that emerge from this other set of changes because of some things will be better there, some things will be worse there. How do they combine with each other? The impact of a best case scenario, when you're thinking of it as a plan, as a concept, is to really get us to think about what can we do if we succeed. The impact of a best case scenario in terms of the real world, if we actually reach that best case scenario, is to think through, okay, now what next? You can't just leave it there, because it's not, even the best case scenario is not an endpoint. You still have to ask what's next.
I think that's quite an important bit. It doesn't end. The process just goes on and on. That's what you're saying, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If I look into the round, those who have raised this question, is that answer given to you? I don't see any hands rising, so we proceed with the next question. Is the Generation Z more capable to deal with BANI, and how is it different to all the generations?
My take on this is that the up and coming generation, whether we call it Z, Z, whatever is the particular term in your area, the up and coming generation is more capable simply because they have been immersed in this from the beginning. Just like we see many millennials, many people who are in their 30s now are are more comfortable with computing and the internet and social media than some of their older compatriots, some of their older colleagues, simply because they have been surrounded by computers and networks from being little children. Similarly, with the up and coming generation of teenagers and people in their 20s, they've been surrounded by chaos. If you think about it, someone who is 20-year-old this year was born after 9/11 in the United States, that massive attack that turned into this massive global war pushed by the United States, and the war on terrorism and all of the things that emerged from that whole arena of behavior. Young people today have grown up in a world immersed, surrounded by, embedded in chaos. And so it is their, maybe metaphorically, their natural language. And so when I look at this up and coming generation, what I see are people who have been conditioned from the outset to think about, how do I adapt to this? How can I live in this world? What are the changes that I need to make? What are the steps that I need to take in order to deal with this, whether I'm 11 years old or 21 years old? The way that differs to older generations is that we are, for many of us, migrants to the future, as opposed to natives in the future. For many of us, we look at this as a changed world. And for very many people, the very existence of this set of changes, the very reality of these changes, is confusing. And one of the things, I'm sure you're all familiar, because it's getting big in Europe too, the QAnon, the Q movement, a political movement, is people who have these outrageous stories about universities and liberals and cannibalism and the return of people who are dead. I mean, it's really increasingly bizarre. But if you look at the details of what they're talking about and the reasoning behind what they're talking about, it all boils down to a sense that they don't understand the world. They can't understand why these changes are happening. There must be somebody behind this. There must be a conspiracy or a cabal, or people who are puppet masters controlling everything, because otherwise the world is chaotic and can't be, and incomprehensible, and that's terrifying. Of the four elements of BANI, brittleness, anxiety, nonlinearity, incomprehensibility, it's incomprehensibility that I think is ultimately the most terrifying for people, because the world has stopped making sense for a great many people on this planet who are on the verge of misery, or have lost their jobs, or have, simply they can't understand why their children are behaving the way they're behaving. It doesn't make sense. And so what I worry about when I talk about BANI, especially with regards to everyday populations, as opposed to very specific organizations, is that BANI manifests as fear for a lot of people. This sense that things are falling apart, that I don't have any good choices, that things don't make sense. That is extremely scary for a great many people. And where I see the up and coming generation, the Generation Z, where I see them being different is that they have been living with this fear, living in this world of chaos from the very beginning.
What becomes quite clear now is that we should invite Generation Z people as soon as possible to that discussion, yeah?
Yes.
Looking around,
yes,
there aren't
please.
many, I can guess. Yeah, that's my takeaway of this answer now, really. Thank you for that. And we've got a last one, and I think you found that quite interesting. You said that hasn't been asked yet. So let's
Yes, no,
deep dive into that.
that is an excellent question, and I would applaud the breakout group that came up with it, because I have not been asked that question and it needed to be asked. Is there a danger that BANI is used in a manipulative way? Yes, because any kind of articulation of a structure for the world can be exploited in a way to make people more fearful and thereby take advantage of them. Without drawing any other comparison, the Q movement that I talked about a moment ago and BANI are similar in that regard. They're a way of structuring how the world, an understanding of the world. BANI, I try to think of it as a way of illuminating the kinds of chaos, the kinds of challenges that we face, as opposed to explaining why it's all one person or one group's fault. I try not to assign blame within BANI, although it may be implicit. I recognize that people could use the BANI language in a way that is intended to change the behavior of others in malicious ways. I don't know if I could stop that. I don't know if any of us could stop that, other than recognizing that it is a possibility. And one of the things I've been talking about from the very outset, from the very beginning of this engagement, is that we need to think about consequences. The whole role of futurism, of foresight, is to understand implications and consequences. That includes when we embrace, a BANI structure for our work, when we use it as a lens through which to look at the world, we have to recognize that there are consequences of doing that as well. Every lens that we use changes the image. Whether we're talking about a physical glass lens or or the lens in our eye. Every lens we use is a manipulation of the photons that come through it. Every lens we use, metaphorically, is a way of filtering and altering the direction of the world around us in a way that gives it greater structure. And so being conscious of those consequences, being conscious of the fact that when we use these tools, we are filtering things, is a very, I think, a very good practice, a very important practice, and one that I don't see done often enough, regardless of the lens, regardless of the framing that we're talking about. So many of us like to think that our frames, our structures that we imagine for the world are reality. That what we understand how the world works, how the pieces fit together, that's reality. When it is a perspective on reality, it is a view through a mirror, through a lens, through a filter that gives us a shape that might not actually be there, because that shape helps us believe we understand things. So if this all makes you doubt, have greater doubt around the utility of BANI, that's fine. I think you should have greater doubt around the utility of any structure of understanding the world, any philosophy of understanding the world. I don't think BANI is a philosophy, but you know what I'm saying, that it's really important to be careful and understand the implications of the ways that arise from the ways you look at the world itself.
Will you take that question with you into further thoughts, or is that something you will just leave like it is now?
No, I think that as I move forward in developing the BANI concept, that's something, this question is going to stick with me. It did come as a little bit of a surprise to see, and a good surprise, because it got me thinking in a new way. It gave me an aha moment. Cool. And so I thank you very much for that. And I definitely will be taking that with me.
Thank you for that, Jamais. And I think